Welcome to Moonlight Audiobook. I'm your host, Julian. Before we begin, grab yourself a warm drink and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from tonight? A grand estate, locked behind silence. A missing carriage, and one guest who never returned. At Highcombe Hall, something dreadful occurred, something no one dares to speak of. But Hercule Poirot is on the case, and he will not rest until the truth is revealed. Today's mystery is the last carriage at Highcombe Hall. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Arrival at Dusk. The storm had crept in from the moors with the stealth of a burglar, quiet at first, then violent. Wind howled through the long sycamore trees that flanked the winding drive of Highcombe Hall, and the rain came in sheets against the tall windows. It was an evening stitched from shadows and thunder. Within the ornate, gaslit walls of the great house, candles flickered in their sconces as the evening's final guest arrived, alone. The clock in the drawing-room had just struck 7:30 when the butler, Grimley, opened the door to admit the carriage. He had heard the rumble long before he saw the vehicle. It was not the sort of coach typically seen delivering guests to Lord Willoughby's famed spring gatherings. Too modest, too worn. And unlike the previous arrivals who had been met with eager chatter and polite applause from fellow guests inside, this carriage brought with it only an oppressive silence. What happened next would become the whispered horror of Highcombe's corridors. The coachman, a man unfamiliar to the household staff, said nothing as Grimley opened the carriage door. He simply pointed. Inside was a figure, slumped, unmoving, and unmistakably dead. The guest was Mr. Charles Havering, a well-known art dealer with business ties to nearly every attendee present. His body was propped awkwardly in the corner of the carriage, mouth agape, eyes glassy, and his evening gloves stained with what the house physician, summoned at once, grimly confirmed to be blood. A fine blade, thin, almost surgical, had punctured his ribcage just beneath the heart. More unnerving still was the utter lack of blood elsewhere. No signs of struggle. No evidence of the weapon. The killer, it seemed, had struck with precision, and vanished into the tempestuous night. Highcombe Hall, an estate of stately elegance and guarded privacy, had played host to many gatherings of distinction, but never had its drawing-room filled with such tension. Lord Willoughby, tall and stately with the pale, bemused expression of an aging lion, gathered his guests together in the blue salon with the quiet authority of a man too well-bred to panic. Yet even he seemed shaken beneath his waxed mustache. Among the gathered were Lady Annabelle Willoughby, his younger, sharp-eyed wife, Miss Julia Crane, the spirited niece with a fondness for dramatics, Major Redfern, a retired military officer with a cane and a temper, Dr. Alaric Weatherby, the local physician whose steady hands now trembled as he sipped sherry, Iris Havering, the dead man's estranged sister-in-law, pale and unreadable behind her veil, and Mr. Felix Ormond, an enigmatic playwright who had arrived just that afternoon from Paris. The servants whispered of a curse. The guests spoke of robbery. And somewhere beyond the firelit rooms and shuttered windows, the wind continued to shriek, as though mourning the man who had arrived at Highcombe Hall only to die at its doorstep. By the next morning, the local constabulary had made little progress. The coachman who had delivered the body vanished shortly after dropping the carriage at the hall's entrance. No one could recall his features clearly. The rain had long since obliterated any useful tracks, and the guests, while ostensibly cooperative, each seemed unhelpfully vague in their recollections of Havering's business and temperament. All claimed to be surprised by his appearance. None had expected him. None admitted to inviting him. And then, just before noon, a modest motorcar rumbled up the gravel drive, flanked by clouds of soft fog still clinging to the moorland. Out stepped a small, fastidiously dressed man with a bowler hat, a silver-handled cane, and an expression of supreme certainty. Hercule Poirot had arrived. He stood beneath the arch of Highcombe Hall's entrance and raised one eyebrow, his eyes flicking to the tall windows, the wrought-iron balconies, and the ancient gargoyles that stared down from the eaves with stony menace. "A house," he said softly, to no one in particular, "is like a person, is it not? It wears a face to the world, but hides secrets behind closed doors." Poirot was ushered inside with much deference by Grimley, who had, in his decades of service, never encountered a man quite like the Belgian detective. Lord Willoughby met him in the library, where a fire had been coaxed into reluctant life, and offered him tea, a gesture Poirot accepted with a gracious nod and a glance at the precisely placed tea service. "I trust you are not unfamiliar with tragedy, Monsieur Poirot," the nobleman said gravely. "None, milord. But I find each one unique. The smallest inconsistency, the softest contradiction. It tells a story all its own." Poirot spent that first afternoon in quiet observation. He examined the abandoned carriage in the stone courtyard, noting the angle of the dead man's limbs and the peculiar placement of a broken cufflink. He requested to see the library guest book. He inquired after the exact timing of the bell that had rung when Havering's carriage arrived. He asked questions, odd questions, seemingly unconnected ones. Why had the guests' dinner jackets been pressed that morning? Why had Iris Havering changed her earrings halfway through the previous evening? Why did the valet, Jenkins, stammer only when speaking of the late Mr. Havering? It was not until the evening, as the storm finally abated, that Poirot stood before the assembled guests in the drawing-room and spoke his first definitive words on the matter. "Monsieur Havering," he began, "did not arrive unexpectedly. At least, not to everyone here." There was a sharp intake of breath. Poirot raised a hand. "Forgive me, I do not make the accusation. Not yet. But consider this, Miss Amos. The last carriage to arrive at Highcombe Hall did not bring a guest, it brought a body. And yet someone among you knew it was coming. Someone had prepared for his death." He turned toward the fireplace, his reflection rippling in the mirrored overmantel above the flames. "This house," he said, "is filled with secrets. But you will find, as always, that they do not remain hidden from Hercule Poirot for long." Chapter 2. The Guests of the House. The morning after the storm was grey and unmoving, as if the moor itself were holding its breath. Highcombe Hall, though quieted, felt uneasy. Servants tiptoed. Breakfast trays were left untouched. Conversations were clipped, and glances lingered longer than politeness required. At precisely 10 o'clock, Hercule Poirot descended the grand staircase, each polished step gleaming under his gleaming black shoes. His attire was impeccable, a dove-grey suit, white pocket square, and his customary egg-shaped head held high. He moved with serene precision toward the blue salon, where Lord Willoughby had offered the use of the room for his inquiries. Poirot surveyed the room carefully before taking his seat at the center. A silver tea service rested untouched beside him. He tapped a notebook once with his pencil, not to write, but to announce that the interviews would begin. Grimley, ever efficient, showed in the first guest. Lady Annabelle Willoughby. The lady of the house entered with the grace of a porcelain figurine, flawless posture, composed voice, and a scent of heliotrope. Her blonde hair was coiled in an elegant chignon, though beneath the calm exterior, Poirot observed a slight tension at the corners of her mouth. She seated herself delicately. "I imagine this is all rather distasteful to you, madam," Poirot began softly. "Distasteful?" she echoed. "It is grotesque. A man murdered on our property, and in such a theatrical fashion." "You knew Mr. Havering?" "Only distantly. He was an art dealer. My husband had occasional dealings with him. We were not close." Poirot tilted his head. "Yet you recognized him instantly, n'est-ce pas?" A beat of hesitation. "Yes, His photograph was once published in the Times. Poirot noted it with a gentle merci, though her pupils had dilated at the word recognized. He leaned forward. And last evening, where were you when the body arrived? In the drawing room. We were playing bridge. Julia and I were partners against the Major and Dr. Weatherby. 4 people, Poirot murmured, all engaged in a game that demands attention, memory, and trust. He paused a beat too long, watching her blink once, slowly. Major Redfern. The Major hobbled in, his cane thumping against the floor like a gavel. Tall, angular, and sun-leathered, he gave the impression of a man permanently annoyed with modern inconveniences. "I don't know what you expect me to say," he barked. "Dashed unpleasant business, but hardly my affair." Poirot's voice remained level. "You were playing bridge when the carriage arrived." "Non." "Indeed. I had just taken the trick with a club. Or was it a diamond?" He squinted in recollection. "You served, did you not, Major?" 28 years. India and East Africa. Ghastly food, excellent whiskey. And you're fond of card games?" "I detest them. My wife insisted I learn before she left me." Poirot allowed a small smile. "Ah, but you played. And well enough to remember the cards." Redfern shifted, tapping the cane. "Look here. You think someone lured that man here? That someone planned it? If so, they're damn clever. Or damn desperate." "Perhaps both," said Poirot. "Or neither." He scribbled something, then gestured. "Merci, Major." Miss Julia Crane. She entered like a bird, light on her feet, with a silken scarf looped around her shoulders and a constant flicker in her eyes. She perched on the edge of her chair. "It's horrid, Monsieur Poirot," she said. "Like something from a dreadful play." "You have a taste for the theatre." "I write little scenes. Dialogues. Mostly for myself." "Did you write one last night?" Her lips parted slightly. "Why do you ask?" "A simple question, mademoiselle." She looked away. "Yes. I was writing in the study before dinner." "Curious," Poirot said. "You were said to be in the drawing room." She hesitated, then smiled. "I was, later. But before the storm hit, I stepped out. I needed inspiration." Poirot leaned back, tapping his chin. "And Mr. Havering, did he ever inspire you?" "Charles Havering," she laughed. "He had the subtlety of a blunt axe. I saw him argue with Iris once in a gallery. Very performative." "Did you like him?" "No. But he made a fine villain." Dr. Alaric Weatherby. He arrived with tired eyes and ink on his cuffs, his waistcoat mismatched with his tie. The local physician was a picture of absent-minded intellect, yet Poirot sensed something unusually guarded behind his polite facade. "I examined the body, of course," he began. "Thin blade. Clean wound. No signs of defensive trauma. Likely stabbed while seated." "You believe he was murdered in the carriage?" "Possibly. Or just placed there shortly after. It's hard to say, no blood pooled." Poirot nodded. "And the time of death?" "Approximately an hour before arrival. Difficult to say without more modern facilities." Poirot folded his hands. "Were you acquainted with the deceased?" "Only peripherally. I treated his wife some years ago. There were tensions." "Tensions?" "Domestic. I cannot elaborate further." "Of course," Poirot said smoothly. "The confidentiality of the doctor is sacred. But you see, I am not the police. I merely observe." Weatherby's jaw twitched. "Yes, well, observation can be a dangerous pastime, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot smiled. Only for the guilty, Dr. Iris Havering. She entered in morning black, her dark eyes hollow but focused. She spoke with the economy of someone used to being misread. "You do not seem surprised, madam," Poirot observed gently. "I'm not. My brother-in-law had a way of collecting enemies like cufflinks." "Ah yes, the broken cufflink in the carriage. You recognize it?" A flicker. "I don't. He wore many. Flashy ones." "You were not close." "We were once. But time does its damage." "Did you know he was coming to Highcombe?" She looked away. "No. But I doubt his visit was innocent." "Why do you say that?" "He wanted something. Charles never did anything without a reason. And when he needed something, he could be persuasive." Poirot noted her choice of words. "Was he persuasive with you, madam?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He tried. Once." Mr. Felix Ormond. The playwright appeared late, with tousled hair and fingers stained from ink. He reclined in his chair, amused by the whole ordeal. "This is delicious," he said. "A locked estate mystery. Thunder, corpses, hidden truths. You find the death of Mr. Havering amusing?" "No, but I recognize a good narrative arc when I see one." Poirot's gaze narrowed. "Writers often borrow from life, and sometimes right ahead of it." "I see. You think I dreamt this scene before it played?" "You tell me, monsieur. What do you write here?" Ormond smiled. "A play. The Last Visitor, about a stranger who arrives uninvited and is found dead before dinner." Poirot said nothing. The silence stretched. Ormond's smirk faded. When the interviews concluded, Poirot stood by the tall windows of the blue salon, hands clasped behind his back. The storm had passed, but the real turbulence, he knew, was only beginning. 6 suspects. 6 different truths. But only one would survive the scrutiny of the little grey cells. Chapter 3: Whispers in the Garden. By late afternoon, the sun had strained weakly through the clouds, casting a silver hue over Highcombe's south lawn. The estate grounds, usually so well kept, now appeared wild, branches scattered, gravel washed from the paths, puddles congealing in flower-beds. Yet Hercule Poirot, umbrella in one gloved hand and notebook in the other, chose this moment to walk. Grimlay followed respectfully at a distance. Poirot paused by the carriage house, where the ill-fated coach had been left, half-sheltered under the stone archway. It had been torped by the constables, though the damp smell of death still clung faintly inside. He examined the interior again, studying the leather seats, the faint scuff marks on the floor, the broken cufflink nestled into a corner like a forgotten coin. He did not touch it. He merely nodded once and whispered, "The absence of the knife. It speaks louder than its presence. Non." Grimlay cleared his throat politely behind him. "Begging your pardon, sir, but Lady Annabelle requests you return to the drawing-room. She says tea is being served." Poirot turned, his face unreadable. "Then let us take tea, mon ami. One must never investigate on an empty stomach." In the drawing-room, the guests had gathered again, more from expectation than invitation. A kind of ritual was forming. Poirot, in his precision, was establishing rhythm. It was not the rhythm of a police inquest. It was slower, more intimate. Psychological. As if each casual question might be a blade. Lady Annabelle poured. Miss Crane doodled in a notebook. Ormond stared into the fireplace, occasionally mouthing silent lines of imagined dialogue. The Major tapped his cane. Dr. Weatherby leaned against a cabinet, watching them all. Poirot accepted his tea, added precisely 2 sugar cubes, and addressed no one in particular. "I find the details most enlightening," he said. "Often, it is not what one sees, but when one sees it." He turned slightly. "For example, Major Redfern, you said you had taken a trick in bridge just before the bell rang. But the clock in the drawing-room had already struck 7:30. The Major frowned. "Yes." Poirot sipped. "And yet, according to Grimlay, the carriage arrived at precisely 7:20. You see the difficulty? The bell could not have sounded after the clock struck." There was a pause. Dr. Weatherby interjected, "Are you suggesting we're all lying, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot smiled. "Ah, Doctor, you mistake me. I suggest that people remember differently, especially when they wish to forget certain things." Ormond chuckled. "You mean, someone doctored the timeline?" Poirot's eyes glinted. "I mean someone knew exactly what time the carriage would arrive, and what it would contain." Later that evening, private conversations begin. Poirot requested to speak with the housekeeper, Mrs. Trevelyan, a thin, precise woman who had served at Highcombe for over 2 decades. They met in the service corridor outside the kitchens, where the copper pans gleamed and the air smelled of lemon polish. "Mrs. Trevelyan," Poirot began softly, "you have eyes that miss little." She gave a short, professional nod. "One learns to observe, monsieur, especially in a house like this. I understand you managed the guest room arrangements personally." "I do. Every spring gathering." Poirot consulted his notebook. "And yet there was no room prepared for Mr. Havering." "No, sir. He wasn't on the list. But someone changed rooms last night. N'est-ce pas?" A slight tightening of her lips. Miss Crane moved from the north wing to the Rose Suite. Said she preferred more light. "And did she have permission?" "She said Lady Annabelle approved it." Poirot bowed slightly. "Merci, madam. And tell me, did anyone ask about locking the garage yesterday? Or the side gates?" She hesitated. "Mr. Ormond said he needed quiet to write, and asked if the servants could avoid the courtyard after 7. "Indeed. Thank you." Nightfall in the library. Poirot sat alone now, the fire casting golden light across the spines of old books. He placed 6 slips of paper in front of him. On each, a name. He studied them with the same intensity as a general surveying a battlefield. Annabelle Willoughby, poised, distant. Too distant? Redfern, blunt, proud. But forgetful, or merely imprecise? Julia Crane, clever, evasive. She lied about where she had been. Dr. Weatherby, rational, defensive, but hiding past tensions. Iris Havering, cold, controlled. Possible victim of the deceased's manipulations. Felix Ormond, self-assured, literary. Too coincidental? Poirot rose and paced. No signs of forced entry. No robbery. The coachman gone. The victim precisely posed. Not a murder of impulse, but of design. So, what is the design? He glanced at the window. The moorland beyond was dark again. Poirot spoke aloud, as if to the mist itself. He was brought here not to visit, but to die. A subtle clue. Before retiring, Poirot passed by the study. Something had caught his eye earlier, an ashtray filled with 3 different brands of cigarette butts. Curious, given that only Redfern was known to smoke. He knelt beside it. One was military issue. One, a French brand favored by Ormond. The third, unfiltered, bitter-smelling, was unfamiliar. He removed a handkerchief and plucked the stub delicately. "So," he said softly, "you were here too, mon inconnu." Back in his room. Before turning in, Poirot made one final note in his diary. The killer planned every detail: timing, weather, witnesses. But there is one thing that cannot be controlled: human psychology. Tomorrow, I will prod the fault lines, and one of them will crack. Chapter 4. A Question of Time. The morning following Poirot's initial inquiries began with a heavy hush over Highcombe Hall. Though the weather had calmed, the household remained under siege, not by storm, but by suspicion. The drawing-room and breakfast table felt less like the social heart of a country estate and more like a silent theatre where each guest rehearsed a role beneath the watchful gaze of the Belgian detective. Poirot took his place at the breakfast table with characteristic precision, barely touching his meal as he observed the others. The usual pleasantries were strained, smiles false, and every glance across the table carried a question or an accusation. By now, the realization had taken root. No one at Highcombe Hall could trust the others, and Poirot had ensured that trust would be a luxury they could no longer afford. The mood was abruptly punctured by the arrival of Inspector Sedgwick from the local constabulary. Mud-streaked boots and a weary face announced his presence before he even entered the hall. He brought with him what appeared, on the surface, to be a revelation. A stable hand from the neighboring village had come forward with a report. On the night of the murder, just after the storm had broken, he had seen a lone figure hurrying down the marsh road, discarding a coat as he limped into the shadows. The inspector's findings were damning in appearance. The coat had been recovered, navy wool, soaked through, torn at the hem. In the pocket, nestled in the lining, lay a single cufflink, distinctive in its silver scrollwork and clearly part of the pair belonging to the deceased, Charles Havering. The implications were immediate, and the gaze of the household quickly turned toward one man. Major Redfern, tall, sharp-featured, and already marked by a war injury that affected his gait, fit the description too precisely to ignore. He was a man already established as irascible and curt, and in the logic of suspicion, that was nearly enough to condemn him. For a brief moment, it appeared the case might have found its solution, or at least the authorities believed so. The narrative was neat. A man with a limp seen fleeing the scene, a possession of the victim found in his abandoned coat, and a motive yet to be declared but already assumed. Yet Hercule Poirot did not embrace such tidiness. He requested to examine the coat with his usual delicacy. While the others stood in silence, he evaluated it not as evidence but as a piece of an unfinished puzzle. The stitching was examined, the lining inspected, and the shoulders measured in Poirot's mind against the frame of the accused. It was in the small things, the absence of pipe smoke in the fabric, the inch-and-a-half discrepancy in the shoulder width, the faint imprint of a label removed too recently to go unnoticed, that Poirot uncovered the flaw. The coat, though superficially damning, had never belonged to Major Redfern. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, only a cool, methodical rearrangement of assumptions. Poirot, calm as ever, revealed that the clue had been too perfect. Someone, he concluded, had wanted Redfern to appear guilty. Someone had planted the coat, equipped it with a single piece of stolen evidence, and left it where it could be discovered by a convenient witness. It was not an oversight. It was design. In that moment, the entire course of suspicion shifted. Where before the household might have accepted Redfern's guilt with resignation, now a far more unsettling possibility emerged. The murderer was among them still, and capable not only of killing, but of manipulating others into taking the fall. Redfern, though cleared, was not grateful. His pride had been wounded, and in a house already saturated with tension, His simmering resentment only deepened the fractures among the guests. Later that day, Poirot returned to the study, alone with his thoughts and the soft crackle of the fire. He opened his notebook and recorded what he now referred to as the first deliberate misdirection. It was not merely a mistake. It had been staged. The murderer, he noted, possessed the discipline to control evidence, the foresight to predict police procedures, and the psychological acumen to select a scapegoat whose flaws would attract attention. But Poirot understood that such precision was both a strength and a vulnerability. A plan so careful must have required prior knowledge, not only of the estate's geography but of its inhabitants' behaviors and reputations. The placement of the coat was particularly telling. The marsh road where it was discovered was one known mostly to the staff and groundsmen. Yet the stable hand who found it had done so at exactly the right moment for the evidence to be useful. This, Poirot observed, required timing. The suspect had known when the body would arrive at Highcombe. The distraction had been preloaded into the night, waiting to unfold with the arrival of a single carriage. As the day wore on, the atmosphere inside the manor thickened. Alliances, once unspoken, now emerged subtly. Pairs who walked together in the garden, glances exchanged in passing, whispered speculation behind closed doors. The power of doubt had been unleashed, and in that fertile ground, Poirot knew, the truth would begin to show its roots. That evening, he returned once more to the carriage where the body had been discovered. The rain-stained interior, cold and inert, now appeared more like a stage than a crime scene. The seating had been carefully preserved, though Poirot's gaze now fell not on the visible, but the spatial, the angle of the limbs, the strange placement of the body, the untouched upholstery beneath Havering's shoulders. There was a restraint to the violence, a sterility. Whoever had killed Charles Havering had done so without passion, but not without intent. Poirot now believed he was no longer studying the murder of a man but the execution of a scheme. The motive had not yet surfaced, but the structure was taking shape. Someone had gone to great lengths not simply to kill, but to control the narrative, to lead others down a false trail, to shape perception. And yet, in doing so, they had made one misstep. Poirot had seen the flaw. He had seen the symmetry, and the crack that ran through its center. As he returned to his room, he wrote a single line in his notebook, underlined 3 times. The coat was not evidence. It was theater. The investigation would now turn in a different direction. Chapter 5. The Matter of the Locked Room. By the 3rd day at Highcombe Hall, the estate no longer felt like a sanctuary of wealth and tradition, but a crucible of mounting tension. The rhythm of daily life had fractured. Conversations were halting, gestures over-examined, and a sense of observation, unspoken yet acute, pressed upon every inhabitant of the house. Somewhere among them was a mind capable of murder, misdirection, and the manipulation of others. And Hercule Poirot, with his careful habits and serene demeanor, remained the quiet eye of this storm. Yet beneath his composed exterior, Poirot's mind was constantly whirring. He had reached a stage in the investigation where the mechanics of the crime no longer interested him as much as the emotional terrain of its players. It was not the how, nor even the who, but the why, and how that motive had shaped behavior long before the murder occurred. He began that morning not with questions, but with silence. He took his breakfast in solitude, declined any scheduled interviews, and instead requested access to the estate's library. There, amidst the polished wood and fading leather tomes, Poirot studied not the books, but the margins of the room, the dust-free patches where volumes had recently been removed, the worn edges of shelves most often handled. People, he often remarked, revealed themselves in their surroundings more than in their words. A cluster of titles caught his eye, volumes on estate law, inheritance structures, and obscure legal loopholes concerning trusts and titles. They bore the marks of recent use. Poirot made no immediate conclusion, but he noted this with care. In murder, as in all human affairs, motive was never conjured from thin air. It lay dormant, developing long before the act itself. By mid-afternoon, Poirot returned to what he called his circle of motive. One by one, he examined the psychological portraits of each resident. Major Redfern, once falsely implicated, now simmered with repressed rage. Yet Poirot sensed that it was pride, not guilt, that animated the man. Redfern was incapable of emotional subtlety. He struck directly, bluntly, and openly. A murderer, yes, but not this murderer. Clara Havering, widow of the deceased, presented a far more delicate case. Her demeanor had shifted subtly, less grief, more restraint. She had not cried openly, nor sought comfort. Instead, she remained occupied with the technicalities. The arrival of the solicitor, the cataloguing of Charles Havering's personal effects, and the management of correspondence. It was, to some, admirable stoicism. But to Poirot, it suggested calculation. Whether that calculation masked guilt or simply a fierce desire to preserve dignity remained to be determined. Then there was Julian March, the family friend and solicitor. Too quiet, too invisible. In Poirot's experience, such men were often underestimated, which made them dangerous. March had inserted himself into household affairs with the subtlety of dust collecting on silk, never obvious, but always present. The others, cousins, staff, and lingering guests, were shades around the edges of the canvas. Any could have knowledge. Any could be complicit. Poirot's next step was not to interrogate but to agitate. He arranged a small gathering in the music room under the pretense of needing information about the timeline of the storm. The group was small: Redfern, Clara, Julian March, and Lady Highcombe herself. He asked only simple questions at first: the precise hour they had heard the carriage, what rooms they had occupied, who had last seen Charles before his departure to London. But Poirot was not listening for answers. He was watching reactions. It was a study in pressure, the way hands fidgeted, eyes flicked away, or voices faltered when the memory strained too far. Julian March, when asked whether he had seen Charles's personal papers before the journey, gave a fraction of a second too long a pause. Clara corrected Redfern's account with unnecessary exactitude. Lady Highcombe, for the first time, looked genuinely uncertain, her authority cracked by the slow realization that her household was no longer her own. Poirot made no accusations, nor did he extend the meeting beyond what decorum allowed. But by the time it concluded, he had gathered what he required. Fear had entered the room, not as panic, but as calculation. The guilty, he observed, did not fear discovery as much as they feared the loss of control. And someone, somewhere in that room, had just realized that the control they once possessed was slipping. That evening, Poirot requested access to Charles Havering's study. Clara agreed reluctantly, but without resistance. The room had been left as it was the night Charles departed. Poirot examined the desk, the writing blotter, the ashtray, the drawer containing sealed envelopes. But it was in the waste-paper basket, half-emptied and forgotten, that he found something useful. A torn sheet of thick writing paper, folded once, then discarded. Most of the contents were illegible, the ink smudged by rainwater or a spill. But in the corner, the beginning of a name was visible. It was not addressed to Clara. It began with the letters Ma. Poirot did not need to complete the name. He already suspected what the letter had been: a draft, perhaps, of a confession or confrontation. Charles Havering had been preparing to sever a tie, or declare one. The presence of that letter, and its destruction, suggested that Charles had come to a decision shortly before his death. And someone else had discovered it. Outside, the storm that had rattled the estate days earlier now felt distant. But inside, the tension swelled again. Poirot retired to his room with the faintest trace of satisfaction in his step. The psychological game was unfolding. The murderer had not only struck with cunning, but had now begun to overstep. Poirot's notebook bore a new entry. The murder was committed not to conceal an act, but to prevent one. The pieces were shifting, and the real game was about to begin. Chapter 6. An Inconvenient Memory. The next morning unfolded with deceptive serenity. The skies over Highcombe were pale and clear, the rain-washed gravel glinting in the sun. From a distance, the estate looked untouched by tragedy. But inside its walls, the fragile calm had begun to crack. Small gestures, too careful, too polite, betrayed the undercurrents that ran through the household. A single false word, a glance misread, could shift suspicion. Poirot spent the early hours in solitude again, but his time was not idle. After breakfast, he made his way to the upper floors of the east wing where the private bedrooms of the family were kept. Lady Highcombe, still draped in veils of matriarchal poise, had granted him full access to her late son's possessions, though not without an audible sigh of disapproval. Dignity, she reminded Poirot, must be preserved even under scrutiny. Inside Charles Havering's bedroom, Poirot moved with the delicacy of a surgeon. Nothing was disturbed unnecessarily. His hands, encased in gloves, touched only what was required. The room was orderly, almost too much so. It bore the bland perfection of a space arranged by a valet, not lived in by a man. Yet it was in such impersonal order that secrets could sometimes hide best. His eyes were drawn to a heavy, leather-bound volume on the side table. It was a book on historical treatises, dry and antiquated. But when Poirot opened it, a thin strip of ivory-colored paper slipped out. He caught it mid-fall. It was a train ticket stub. One way, London to a small village near Dover. The date printed was 3 days before Charles Havering's supposed journey, the same date on which he had reportedly postponed his business trip. Poirot studied the ticket, then closed the book with care. Why had Charles purchased a ticket he had not declared? And why Dover, a location irrelevant to his known affairs? He returned to the bookshelf. One by one, he examined titles not for their content, but for what they might hide. Inside a hollowed encyclopedia volume, he found what he suspected might be there. A packet of correspondence, tied with faded green ribbon. He did not open them immediately. Instead, he brought the bundle downstairs to Lady Highcombe's morning room. She was seated with tea, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. He placed the packet gently before her. "These were hidden among your son's things, madam," he said with gentleness. "I seek your permission to read them." She stared at the ribbon for a moment, her gloved hand trembling faintly before resting atop the parcel. "They belong to Margaret," she said quietly. Poirot inclined his head. He did not need to ask who Margaret was. "She was a girl from the village," Lady Highcombe continued, her voice low but steady. "Unsuitable, of course. A gardener's daughter. Charles was infatuated, but I intervened. It was years ago." "And the correspondence?" Poirot asked. "I believed it ceased. Clearly, I was wrong." She pushed the letters toward him. Back in the drawing room, Poirot read them methodically. The letters were tender, filled with restrained emotion and practical longing. Margaret wrote of a small cottage by the coast, of plans quietly laid and hoped-for futures. In one letter dated only weeks before the murder, she expressed concern about being discovered and Charles's hesitation to speak to his family at last. It was not difficult to piece the fragments together. Charles had rekindled a relationship long deemed scandalous by his class. He had hidden it well, too well, and the reappearance of that past, cloaked in secrecy and emotional defiance, had likely threatened someone. Poirot set the letters aside, his mind knitting the emotional web tighter. If Charles had intended to reveal his plans, perhaps to marry Margaret, perhaps to abandon the family's expectations, then his murder took on a clearer motive. It was no longer about the past, but the future. Someone had much to lose if Charles changed his course. The second murder, Poirot now believed, had been preemptive. The killer had not only silenced a man, but sought to obliterate an inconvenient future before it could be made public. Later that afternoon, Poirot took a walk in the estate gardens. The late summer sun warmed the trimmed hedgerows, and the scent of lavender lingered in the air. Julian March approached, quiet as ever, his hands behind his back. "I hear you've been reviewing Charles's private papers," March said without accusation, but with the calm calculation of a man who measured every word. Poirot nodded. "One uncovers many things in silence, Monsieur March. I find that the past rarely rests quietly." Julian offered a tight smile. "Do let me know if anything of legal significance appears. The family will require discretion." Poirot inclined his head, but made no promise. As March walked away, Poirot observed his posture. Reserved. Too reserved. A man practiced in distance. And yet, Poirot had noticed the faintest strain around the eyes when the name Margaret had been uttered earlier in the day. The next clue came not from a drawer or letter, but from the stable boy. A quiet lad named Peter, who had worked the grounds since childhood. Poirot, ever courteous to servants, had taken to chatting with him casually. When asked if Charles had left alone that night, Peter hesitated. "I didn't see him leave, sir," the boy admitted. "Only heard the wheels." But there were two sets of footprints by the stable door. One was Mr. Havering's. The other, well, lighter, smaller. "Did you report this?" Poirot asked softly. Peter looked away. "Didn't think it mattered. With all them saying he went off alone. I thought I must have been mistaken." Poirot gave the boy a quiet thank you and walked slowly back to the house. Another passenger had entered the last carriage. Someone whose presence had not been accounted for. The implications shifted again. Perhaps Charles had not fled to London. Perhaps he had been led to his death. That evening, Poirot made a single note in his journal. The truth, like the tide, leaves its debris behind. He had nearly all the pieces. But one more fracture in the household's facade would bring the secret to the surface. Chapter 7. Lady Annabelle's Account. Night once again settled over Highcombe Hall, the shadows creeping across its stone walls like silent observers. But this night was different. It was no longer haunted merely by the memory of murder, but by the knowledge that truth, unearthed, unwelcome, was fast approaching. The house itself seemed to sense the shift, its silence no longer peaceful but taut with anticipation. Poirot remained in the study long after the others had retired. A solitary lamp burned at the corner desk, casting long fingers of gold across the open floor. Beside him lay the letters from Margaret, now ordered and annotated in his small, elegant handwriting. The train ticket stub rested beside them like a punctuation mark, one that could not be ignored. He considered the facts once more. Charles Havering had arranged to leave for Dover, quietly, under a false pretense. He had not travelled to London, as claimed. A second set of footprints had been found near the stables, light and narrow, suggesting female shoes. And the missing timepiece, removed from Charles's wrist after death, had yet to be located. Each fragment alone whispered uncertainty. Together, they shouted betrayal. Yet, Poirot did not permit himself the indulgence of theory. Not yet. The time for imagination would come only after the facts had all been properly aligned. For now, he waited, not for a clue, but for a mistake. It came just before midnight. A soft knock on his door, hurried and cautious. Poirot stood, adjusting his cuffs as he crossed to open it. On the other side stood Beatrice Langley, her face drawn, her expression unreadable. I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "Yet you are," Poirot replied, stepping aside. "And you have something you wish to say, mademoiselle." Beatrice entered, wringing her hands. Her earlier coolness had vanished. In its place stood a woman worn by conflict, between loyalty and conscience, fear and truth. "I've remembered something," she said at last, her voice just above a breath. "The night Charles disappeared, Julian wasn't in the house." Poirot tilted his head. "Not in the house? At what hour?" "Just before midnight. I came down for a glass of water. I saw him leaving by the east corridor door, towards the stables." "And you said nothing?" "I wasn't sure what I saw. And she stopped herself. Julian is persuasive." Poirot offered her a chair. She sat, still holding herself rigid. "There is more," she admitted. "This morning, I found something odd in the drawing-room cabinet. It had been locked for years. But I know Lady Highcombe keeps an extra key behind the portrait of her late husband. I used it." Poirot said nothing. Her confession was its own music. He need only listen for the discordant note. Beatrice drew a small item from her coat pocket, wrapped in a velvet handkerchief. She set it on the table and slowly pulled the cloth away. It was a wristwatch, tarnished with a faint smear of rust. No, dried blood, across the leather strap. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Where exactly did you find this?" "In the cabinet, inside a decorative vase. It was hidden beneath the dried flowers." He turned the watch in his hands. The time was frozen, 12:17. Poirot exhaled quietly. The estimated time of death was shortly after midnight. Beatrice looked away. "I'm sorry. I should have said something earlier." "You have said it now," Poirot replied gently. "And you may have altered the course of this investigation." After she had gone, Poirot remained alone with the watch. A detail occurred to him then, one of those delicate threads others so often overlooked. The strap bore a faint indentation where the wrist's curve would meet the bone. But the impression was not consistent with Charles Havering's build, which Poirot had examined in photographs and described accounts. It was too narrow. The watch had not belonged to Charles. It had been placed upon him. To mislead. To conceal. And someone had hidden it. Clumsily. The next morning, Poirot requested a private word with Julian March. The solicitor obliged, as courteous as ever, though a trace of weariness now lingered in his eyes. They met in the library. Poirot kept the tone civil, almost cordial. "Monsieur March," he began, "I must ask, did you leave the house the night Charles Havering disappeared?" Julian hesitated. Just slightly. A pause so short most would have missed it. "I did not," he answered. "Are you quite certain?" March's composure stiffened. "If you're suggesting—" "I suggest nothing. I inquire." There was a long silence between them. Poirot let it stretch. Then Julian spoke again, this time more deliberately. "I was restless. I went for air. Perhaps I walked near the stables. I didn't note the hour." Poirot studied him carefully. "And were you alone?" "Yes." The lie sat uneasily in the room. When March had gone, Poirot turned to the window. Outside, the clouds rolled in over Highcombe once more, dark and patient. Another layer had been peeled back. The time was near. Soon, the truths would rise, uninvited and unkind. Chapter 8. Details in the Ledger. The mood at Highcombe Hall shifted once more. A quiet dread had settled across the estate, like fog rising from the earth. No longer the uneasy disquiet of a household in mourning, but the sharp, cold air of exposure. Something was coming. The air seemed to pulse with it. The inhabitants moved through their routines with mechanical grace, eyes avoiding one another, words clipped short. No one dared ask what Hercule Poirot was thinking, but all were sure he was thinking something. Poirot kept to himself that morning, taking slow walks along the perimeter of the gardens, hands clasped behind his back, his head slightly bowed, not with weariness, but with intense concentration. Occasionally, he would pause to inspect a trail of crushed leaves or study the house's upper windows from an oblique angle. He left no trace of urgency in his steps, but everything in his bearing suggested a man drawing the final outline of a portrait already known to him. He had gathered all the fragments. Now came the arrangement. The events of the night before played repeatedly in his mind. Beatrice Langley's confession had provided more than a clue. It had illuminated motive and movement. The wristwatch, found so ineptly concealed, had betrayed the murderer's panic. But most revealing was what the killer had not done. The attempt to pin guilt onto Charles through the staged disappearance, the false telegram, and now a misleading piece of physical evidence, reeked of a mind clever but imperfect. A desperate mind, rather than a cold one. Poirot returned to the drawing-room late in the morning. There, Lady Highcombe sat near the fireplace, staring into nothing. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, the knuckles pale. The fire behind her cast long shadows across the carpet, dancing like memories. He did not greet her immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to the portrait above the mantel. Her late husband, Lord Highcombe, painted in the full regalia of a naval commander. The man's face was proud, unsmiling, his eyes rendered in the artist's brush with a shade too dark to be kind. Lady Highcombe followed Poirot's eyes. "He would hate all of this," she murmured. "Would he?" Poirot replied. "And yet he left you this place. This isolation. This theatre." A flicker passed over her face. It was not grief. "I do not believe, madam," he continued softly, "that Charles Havering was your favorite guest." Her lips pressed together, but she did not deny it. Poirot continued. "But you tolerated him. Because to disapprove of a marriage after the fact, especially one entered into without your blessing, would only have driven Margaret further away." Still she said nothing, but her gaze lowered. Poirot stepped toward the sideboard. On it, a line of family photographs in silver frames. The wedding portrait of Margaret and Charles took pride of place in the center. He lifted it gently, brushing a trace of dust from its corner. "Why did Margaret leave for the village so suddenly?" he asked without looking at her. "Why not remain here, surrounded by her family, during a time of grief?" "She needed space," Lady Highcombe replied quickly. "Time to collect herself." "But you have the impression that she fled," he said quietly. Her silence gave the answer. "Thank you," Poirot said, and returned the photograph to its place. That afternoon, the hall's rhythm broke once more. A letter arrived, unstamped, hand-delivered by a boy from the village, addressed simply to Monsieur Hercule Poirot. Poirot read it alone in the library, seated beneath the heavy beams that arched overhead like the ribs of a ship. The note was brief, unsigned, and written in an unsteady hand. "I was there that night. I saw what I should not have. Meet me in the chapel woods. Dusk. Alone." The trap was too obvious. The anonymity, the urgency, the seclusion, it was laid like bait. But Poirot, ever the cat to the mouse, considered it not with fear, but with precision. He would go. Not because he trusted the source, but because such acts, however clumsily conceived, often revealed far more than their orchestrators intended. Dusk approached. Poirot left the house without announcement, following the old stone path that led past the orchard and toward the narrow woods behind the estate. The air was still. Not even the birds disturbed the hush. The chapel lay in ruins now, its roof long collapsed, ivy strangling its outer walls. Beyond it, the trees thickened, their trunks rising like silent witnesses. Poirot stepped carefully along the path until the undergrowth gave way to a small clearing where the moonlight fractured through the leaves. He waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. And then, footsteps. Soft, hesitant. A figure emerged from the trees, a girl, perhaps 18. Her coat was too large, her hair pulled into a nervous braid. "I didn't know who else to tell," she whispered. Poirot beckoned her closer. "I work in the kitchens," she said, her voice shaking. "I was coming back from the stables that night. I saw someone moving around the side of the house, near the east wing. It wasn't Mr. Havering. Can you describe them?" She nodded. "Tall, slim, a man. But not him. He was carrying something. A heavy coat, or maybe a blanket. I couldn't tell. But he was headed toward the old carriage house." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "You are certain of the direction?" "Yes, sir." He thanked her gently, watched as she disappeared into the trees, then turned on his heel. The final piece of the puzzle had just shifted into place. Chapter 9. The Knife in the Flower Bed. The carriage house stood at the far edge of the estate grounds, forgotten, shrouded in overgrowth, and tilted slightly with age. Once a proud shelter for the Highcombe's fine travelling coaches, it now slouched against time, its doors warped, its stone path overtaken by moss. No one had reason to visit it anymore. No one, that is, except someone in need of concealment. Poirot arrived just before dawn, the morning mist still curling along the earth like a blanket retreating from the cold. The key to the carriage house had not been used in years, yet the lock bore fresh scratches. The bolt slid back with surprising ease. Inside, shadows clung to every beam, and the faint scent of mildew drifted in the still air. Poirot's gaze swept the interior without haste. A broken will leaned against the far wall. Rusted lanterns hung like forgotten sentinels. At first glance, the space held nothing but decay. But Poirot was not one to glance. He studied. And then, behind a stack of old trunks, half swallowed by tarpaulin, he found it, the last carriage. It was black, its paint dull to charcoal, its leather canopy stiff with time. But it was intact, untouched for years, by all appearances. Yet Poirot, ever the connoisseur of disorder, noted the disarranged dust on the floor. Recent footprints, partially smudged, led around to the rear wheels. A scuff on the polished brass step. The faintest streak of something, dried, but once red, along the side panel. He crouched and examined the undercarriage. There, carefully wedged near the axle, a torn fragment of cloth. Black wool, but finer than the carriage's own weathered trim. A thread caught in a splinter of wood, stubborn and silent. Poirot straightened. His eyes narrowed, and a thought flickered across his mind like lightning behind cloud. He stepped around to the back and opened the small rear storage hatch. It groaned but yielded. Inside, empty space, and then, in the right-hand corner, a brass button. Polished. Too polished. He pocketed it without a word. Later that morning, the household stirred to news of the discovery. Lady Highcombe received Poirot in her private parlour, seated near the tall window overlooking the gardens. Her expression was unreadable, though her fingers gripped the armrest with an involuntary tremor. "You've found something," she said. Poirot inclined his head. "Oh, madam. I have found what one might call a ghost. The ghost of a journey that someone wished to erase." He paused. "The last carriage at Highcombe Hall," he continued, "was used the night of the murder." Lady Highcombe's eyes widened slightly. Poirot did not miss it. Used? She echoed. To remove something. Or someone. Perhaps a body. Perhaps a piece of evidence. Either way, it was an attempt to mislead, to shift timelines, misplace a death, confuse the eye. She said nothing. I do not believe the murder occurred in the drawing room, he added. Nor in the library, as some have whispered. I believe it occurred elsewhere, and that the body was moved. She rose then, slowly. That is a grave suggestion, Monsieur Poirot. Grave indeed, he replied gently. She turned away, gazing out the window. You must understand. Our family has already endured scandal. My husband, his affairs, the court cases, her voice faltered. This place, our name, it hangs by a thread. Poirot approached her with quiet dignity. Madam, the truth, however bitter, is preferable to the slow poison of speculation. Her shoulders sank. Tell me, he said softly, did you recognize the wristwatch I found? A long silence. Then, very quietly, yes. To whom did it belong? Another pause. My son. Poirot nodded slowly. But Charles wore it that night, she said suddenly, turning. I saw it on his wrist at dinner. Then someone exchanged it after his death, Poirot said. Or planted it to suggest a timeline that did not exist. She shivered. Who would do such a thing? Poirot met her eyes. Someone who knew that perception could rewrite a crime. Later that afternoon, Poirot requested the presence of Beatrice Langley. She arrived pale, clutching her handbag like armor. You told me, Poirot said evenly, that you saw Mr. Havering arguing with Margaret in the conservatory, that she ran out crying. But you did not follow her. Beatrice hesitated. No, but you did see something. She swallowed. I saw someone enter the old coach path, she admitted. A figure in a cloak. I thought it was Charles at first. But it wasn't. Poirot stepped closer. Was it your brother? Her eyes widened in alarm. You think? I think, said Poirot slowly, that he knew more than he told. She dropped her gaze. That evening, the tension within Highcombe Hall coiled tight. Poirot walked the corridors once more, glancing at portraits, doorways, stairwells. Each detail was a note in a silent song. And when he retired to his guest room, he did not sleep. He was arranging the chairs in his mind. Tomorrow, he would summon them all. Tomorrow, the performance would begin. Chapter 10. Clocks and Contradictions. The drawing room of Highcombe Hall had seen many evenings of polite laughter and crisp decanters, but never had it played host to a gathering quite like this. The air was expectant, drawn tight as violin string. Curtains were drawn, firelight glowed low, and all the suspects were seated, each in a chair that Poirot had personally arranged in a precise semicircle. He stood before them, not as a guest, but as a conductor ready to orchestrate the finale. To his left, Lady Highcombe, veiled in silk and silence. Beside her, Beatrice Langley, visibly tense, fingers trembling against her lap. Next, Reginald Havering, arms crossed, jaw rigid. Then young Julian March, looking not at Poirot, but at the floor. Finally, Miss Carlton, still and unreadable, her gloved hands folded neatly. Poirot began. You have all wondered, he said, why I have summoned you this evening. Some believe the answer is already known. Others suspect I have yet to reach a conclusion. In truth, I have had the answer for some time. But as with every mystery, timing is everything. He paced slowly. Let us consider, first, the murder of Charles Highcombe. A man of pride, ambition, and secrets. Shot in the heart. A pistol found in the pond. A watch at his side. All clues designed, Ms. Amos, to lead us away from the truth. Eyes shifted. No one spoke. Poirot stopped beside the hearth. It was said he was killed in the drawing room. That a shot was heard. But I ask, who actually saw the body before the household gathered? There was no reply. No one, he said softly. And that, my friends, is the heart of it. The body was moved. And where, you ask, did the murder truly occur? He raised his hand. In the last carriage of the old coach house. Gasps. Beatrice's hand flew to her mouth. Lady Highcombe went pale. Poirot pressed on. That carriage had not been touched in years, until that night. Fresh marks. A blood smear. A torn thread of fine wool. Someone used it not only to conceal the crime, but to shift its apparent timing. Charles Highcombe was killed earlier than we were led to believe. Reginald Havering spoke at last. That's impossible. I saw him at the house before the gathering. He greeted me in the corridor. Poirot turned. Did you speak with him? No, he was moving quickly, toward the garden, I think. Then I must ask, Mr. Havering, are you quite certain it was him you saw? Havering frowned. Who else would it? Poirot raised a hand. Someone dressed as him. Someone wearing his coat. Someone who knew, precisely, the effect such an illusion would have. His eyes landed on Julian March. The young man's breath caught. Poirot walked to the center of the room. Julian March, he said, you told me you had gone to the stables that evening. That you were alone. Yes, came the quiet reply. But you lied, said Poirot. Julian looked up sharply. You were not at the stables. You were at the coach house. You knew of the carriage. You even assisted in moving the body. No. You believed you were protecting someone. You did not pull the trigger, but you helped cover the act. Poirot paused. And that someone was your mother. Lady Highcombe stiffened. No, she whispered. Poirot turned to her. Madam, you knew. You always knew. That night, you went to confront your son. You had discovered something, perhaps the fraud with the estate accounts, perhaps something more personal. We will never know the exact argument. But in the struggle, the shot rang out. Lady Highcombe closed her eyes. I wanted only to protect the name, she murmured. Our name. Poirot nodded solemnly. Which is why you moved the body, hid the pistol, took the watch from his wrist and left it as a decoy. But someone else witnessed the act, someone who did not report it, but who blackmailed you instead. He turned now to Miss Carleton. Did he promise you the inheritance? He asked. Or was it revenge? The governess met his eyes. It was justice, she said coldly. He promised my sister marriage, then discarded her. She died by her own hand. And so you plotted. No, she snapped. I only learned the truth after the murder. I said nothing, in exchange for silence. But yes, I moved the pistol. Yes, I helped hide the evidence. I wanted her to suffer. Quietly. Slowly. Poirot exhaled. The room was utterly still. You see, he said at last, the truth was never buried in shadows. It was buried in shame. He stepped back, allowing silence to fill the space, letting each person sit with their guilt. Then came the knock at the door. Inspector Fernley entered quietly, took in the scene, and nodded toward Poirot. The arrests would follow. But for now, Poirot allowed himself a moment of stillness, his gaze drifting toward the window, where the dawn crept softly against the velvet curtains. Chapter 11. The Gathering in the Library. As the last echoes of Inspector Fernley's retreating footsteps faded, Poirot remained where he stood, at the center of the semicircle of empty chairs. Only two remained occupied. Lady Highcombe, her veil lowered, her posture proud yet weary, and Julian March, who sat with clenched fists and eyes that flickered not with fear, but with a quiet, tightening despair. Poirot looked at neither directly. His gaze wandered across the hearth, the mantelpiece, the portrait of the late Sir Charles, a stiff rendering of a man who, in life, had built walls with his words and armed them with secrets. "It is curious," Poirot said softly, "how often the mind hides from truth it already knows." He moved toward a small side table, straightening the silver frame of a photograph. A younger Charles Highcombe, smiling with a boy who looked too thin, too serious, too guarded. "Tell me, Julian," Poirot continued, without looking at him, "when did you first learn that Sir Charles Highcombe was your father?" There was a pause, a breath caught in the throat. "Then, 3 months ago." Poirot nodded. "Not long before he summoned you to Highcombe Hall." A silence settled, dense as fog. "He told me the truth," Julian said at last. "Told me about my mother. That she had been a servant. That I was born out of duty, not affection. He said he had given her money to disappear." Poirot finally turned to face him. "And how did you feel?" Julian's lips curled into a bitter smile, as if everything made sense, and nothing did. "I came here hoping he would, I don't know, acknowledge me, welcome me. Instead, he demanded my silence. Said he would see what I was made of." "A beat," Poirot said, and then came the moment of confrontation. "In the carriage." Julian stiffened. "I didn't kill him." "I know." Lady Highcombe stirred. Her voice was steady. "I did." Poirot raised a hand gently. "Non, madam. That is not true." She looked up, startled. It was Beatrice Langley. The room froze. Poirot continued as if merely recounting a weather report. She was the only one with true access to Sir Charles's private correspondence. The only one who knew the truth of Julian's parentage before he arrived. And she feared deeply, that Julian might replace her in Charles's will. She had long relied on Charles's patronage, his protection. He moved to the firelight, folding his hands behind his back. Miss Langley confronted Charles in the carriage before the gathering. They argued. She accused him of betrayal, of selfishness. And when he dismissed her with that particular coldness only the powerful can wield. He looked up slowly. She fired the pistol she had carried for weeks. A rustle of footsteps at the far door. Fernley returned, escorting Beatrice Langley, pale, lips pinched, hands bound before her. Poirot offered no dramatics. She moved the body with Julian's help, without him realizing the nature of her involvement. He believed he was protecting his mother. "And you, Lady Highcombe, perhaps you suspected. But your silence was not guilt. It was fatigue. You have kept far too many secrets for far too long." Beatrice turned her eyes toward Poirot, fury briefly lighting her face. "He discarded me. For a boy with nothing." Poirot replied, evenly, "He discarded everyone, madam. That is why you are all here." He stepped aside as Fernley led Beatrice from the room. Then, only the fire remained. Julian rose slowly. "You knew all along, didn't you?" Poirot inclined his head. "I suspected. But truth is not only about knowing. It is about when you speak." Julian looked at Lady Highcombe. "Was it true?" She nodded, her voice nearly a whisper. "He was your father. I knew. I knew the moment I saw you." Julian said nothing. Poirot turned toward the door. It is not often justice takes the shape we expect. But in this case, it has worn its proper face. He reached for his hat and coat. Behind him, The house breathed again, old walls reclaiming their stillness, ancient shadows curling back into their corners. Highcombe Hall, for all its grandeur, would never be what it once was. But perhaps, now, it could begin to forget. And Poirot, stepping out into the pale light of dawn, allowed himself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. Not for the applause of the solution, but for the delicate symmetry of the truth finally restored. Chapter 12. A Question of Motive. The days that followed passed beneath a heavy stillness, as if Highcombe Hall itself had inhaled and refused to exhale. In the hush that trailed after revelation, servants moved with soft, reverent steps, and conversations fell into murmur. The house, its bones ancient, its silence absolute, seemed to mourn not only Sir Charles Highcombe, but the illusion of invincibility that had clung to his name. Beatrice Langley was taken into custody without resistance. In the town below, word spread with restrained shock. A trusted secretary, a woman of apparent loyalty. But as with many masks, the closer one looked, the more transparent they became. Poirot had seen it from the first, a flicker in her voice, the forced stillness of a woman who had rehearsed her emotions too precisely. At the inquest, Julian March gave testimony with composure touched by sorrow. He did not defend Beatrice, nor did he condemn her. In his words, there was a recognition of complexity, of how long-standing loyalty, when soured by bitterness, could become lethal. The jury returned its verdict quickly. Guilty. A crime of passion and fear. The newspapers spun it with modest scandal. Secretary slays baronet in heated quarrel over estate dispute. But the deeper truth, the human knots beneath the headlines, remained largely untold. Poirot, having declined to appear at the inquest, lingered at the estate a day longer than expected. The countryside, cloaked in soft mist, had begun to lose the brittle edge of winter. Trees stirred faintly with the promise of spring, though their branches remained skeletal and bare. Nature, like people, required time to thaw. In the drawing-room, Poirot sat across from Lady Highcombe. The morning sun filtered through lace curtains onto the silver of her untouched breakfast tray. "You will remain here?" Poirot asked gently. Lady Highcombe, still wrapped in quiet mourning, gave a slow nod. "This house is my last duty. I cannot leave it untended." Poirot studied her, the faint lines of restraint around her mouth, the posture honed by years of suppression. There had been strength in her silence, and in her confessions, even more so. "You were never truly his prisoner, madam," Poirot said. "Only the guardian of what he could not face." A flicker of something, relief, perhaps, crossed her eyes. "And Julian?" she asked after a pause. "He leaves today for Devon," Poirot replied. "The solicitor has confirmed that Sir Charles named him sole heir 3 weeks before his death." Quietly, without announcement. Lady Highcombe looked up sharply. "He never told me." Poirot smiled faintly. Sir Charles preferred to appear immovable. But beneath the stone was a pulse. However late, he sought to atone. In his way. She looked toward the window, where a single magpie stood silhouetted on the stone balustrade, pecking at nothing. "He has your strength," Poirot added softly. Lady Highcombe said nothing, but in her silence was acceptance. Later that morning, Poirot stood at the gates of Highcombe Hall, his valise beside him, the frost on the wrought iron beginning to melt. Julian March approached from the house, a satchel slung over his shoulder. He stopped before Poirot, offering a hand. "I should thank you." Poirot took it with care. "None. You should only live well. That is thanks enough." Julian looked back at the hall. This place, it held so many things I didn't understand. Now that I do, I don't know if I feel better. Just different. Poirot's eyes softened. Understanding rarely brings comfort, but it brings truth. And with truth comes the freedom to choose your path. A motor car arrived, dust rising as it crunched over gravel. Julian gave a final glance at the estate, then climbed in without further word. Poirot watched until the vehicle turned out of sight, swallowed by hedgerows and memory. That afternoon, he departed by train. In his compartment, he sat alone, eyes closed, fingertips pressed together. The countryside blurred past the window, all greens and browns and the slow awakening of spring. He thought, not of names or confessions, but of motive. Always, always the motive. It had not been greed alone that moved Beatrice Langley's hand, nor pride that led Sir Charles to abandon his son for decades, nor silence for silence's sake that held Lady Highcombe so long in its grasp. It had been fear of change, of loss, of being unloved and irrelevant. And fear, Poirot knew, was more dangerous than hatred. It whispered lies dressed as protection. It turned memory into weapon. It built prisons with lace and politeness. But it could be unmade. Poirot adjusted the angle of his cravat, frowning at a minuscule imperfection in the knot. Once satisfied, he sat back again, the rhythmic clatter of the rails soothing in its repetition. The little grey cells had done their work. But now, they rested. In time, another mystery would call to him. Another wound beneath civility. Another house with shadows behind its windows. But for now, the matter of Highcombe Hall was closed. Justice, imperfect though it might be, had found its shape. And Hercule Poirot, alone in thought, allowed the countryside to carry him forward, not away from truth, but always toward it. If you enjoyed tonight's mystery, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Moonlight Audiobook, and share it with fellow lovers of classic detective tales. Your support helps keep these timeless stories alive, one mystery at a time. And tell us in the comments, what did you think of the last carriage at Highcombe Hall? Until next time, keep your mind sharp, your tea warm, and your heart open to wonder. Goodbye.